We are live.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Transitional Justice in the USA Speakers Series. I am Lisa LaPlante, Director of the Center of International Law and Policy, where I'm also at New England Law School, Boston, where I'm also a law professor. So this speaker series was launched this spring, 2021, and it seeks to explore various themes related to the field of transitional justice as it relates to current efforts in the United States to redress racial injustice and violence. Today's panel is entitled, How do we build collaborative models for a transitional justice process? And it seeks to explore how human rights and academic institutions and their affiliates can best support an existing and robust grassroots network of racial justice advocates working on these themes in a way that doesn't replicate the same predominant power structures that these movements seek to dismantle. Before we get started, I do want to thank our 37 co-sponsors. This is a collaborative initiative, and I appreciate that support. And in particular, I want to thank the co-sponsors who were able to make a financial contribution to this panel, in particular, the Center for Mexican Studies at UMass Boston, the Human Rights Center at Minnesota Law School, and the Young Initiative on the Global Political Economy at Occidental College. Also, those co-sponsors who made in-kind contributions through their involvement in the planning committee, the International Center for Transitional Justice, the Mary Hawk Center for Reconciliation at George Mason University, and the School of Diplomacy and International Relations at Seton Hall University. Just a few logistics. Before we get started, the chat will be disabled during the panel discussion, but you can post questions on the Q&A feature of the webinar. We will open up for a discussion of some of those questions in the chat will be enabled at that time. We also invite you to participate in an interactive session that follows to discuss some approaches to this bigger question through a restorative justice process led by Jody Geddes. And we will be putting a link in the chat. It is a separate meeting and we will conclude the webinar. And then those of you who want to continue the conversation can join that interactive session. So to get us started, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's panel, Ashley Kwaku, who's a senior fellow at the Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and currently a visiting fellow at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. So I will turn it over to Ashley to moderate today's panel.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and to you and your co-sponsors for facilitating this conversation. And I'm delighted to be able to facilitate this conversation, which I hope will be the start of a broader discussion about the ways in which the global transitional justice academic and practitioner community can best support and amplify the work of grassroots activists in the United States who are seeking truth, repair, and redress for the harms inflicted on their communities. I come to this conversation myself, not as a global transitional justice practitioner, not as an academic, and certainly not as an activist. I am, however, the daughter of parents who grew up under the rule of Jim Crow in Tennessee and Alabama, who myself grew up in a Georgia which still flew the Confederate symbol as a part of its state flag, who was educated in the narratives of the mythology of the lost cause. And I've spent over a decade as an international development practitioner working in societies emerging from conflict or from massive human rights abuses, who are also trying to answer the same question. How can we understand what has happened to our people? And how can we be and feel safe enough to continue to live in community with those who sought to harm us? Both domestic activists here and members of the global transitional justice community recognize that the US, which really has been the pioneer of this field known as transitional justice, is itself a society that is in profound need of its own process of truth, repair, and redress. And so this moment of awakening has galvanized a new energy among those of us who have long been eager to see such processes blossom in our own context. And as a collective, we're right to take note of it and to work to capture this opportunity. I view the eagerness of experts and researchers to support this movement as an incredibly valuable asset. However, the need for transitional justice itself in the United States emerges out of historic power imbalances that have disproportionately marginalized, harmed, and silenced communities of color. And so the remedy cannot replicate the problem it was meant to address if it replicates these same power imbalances. And so this is the opportunity here and now to transform these dynamics. One of the many hats that I wear, in addition to those that Lisa laid out, is as manager of a project called Who Is Us? It's a project on national identity with the Aspen Institute. And the question of who is us is a question we've been asking and debating since even before we became a nation. It has driven much of the most significant conflict and achievement of our nation's journey towards democracy, from the Civil War to the passing of the 19th Amendment. And the question of the identity that binds a nation together matters more in a democracy of diverse ancestry, religion, culture, ideology, and relationship to the land. And our narrow narratives of American identity have tended to disproportionately embrace the positive stories of white early settlers while erasing the violent pieces of that history, and thereby making it easier to ignore the ways that that violence continues today. Our narrative is a combination of both achievement and abuse. And this work of truth telling and repair is an integral part of coming to terms with that more nuanced and complete story of this country. This is in part what the tools of transitional justice may offer to the United States in this moment where we are so deeply contesting our history, our identity, and who we want to be in relationship to each other. So with that, I'm delighted to introduce our panelists who will help us unpack some of the challenges of how and for whom we engage in this work in the United States. We're going to confront the complexities of power, which characterize the relationship between international transitional justice practitioners and academics and every host country in which they engage. Power which resides with largely white and Western academics and practitioners that deploy as experts in global TJ processes or engage them as subjects in their academic research. We'll confront the risks of exploitation that come when academics and practitioners seek to engage grassroots and often under-resourced communities for their own institutional and research agendas. But we're also going to explore how we can better manage these tensions, how we can transform these relationships to be more collaborative, mutually supportive, and respectful of local voices and experience, so that we can reach what I know is a shared aspiration of a more inclusive, just, and democratic society. And so with no further ado, I'll introduce this fantastic panel, beginning with Dr. David Ragland, who is co-founder and co-executive director of the Truth Telling Project and the director of the Grassroots Reparations Campaign. Jody Geddes, who is Healing Circles manager with the Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth and also co-manager of Coming to the Table. Professor Jennifer Llewellyn, the Yogis and Ketty Chair in Human Rights Law in the Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie University of Canada. And Christine Dindisi McCleave, the Chief Executive Officer of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. Each of our panelists will speak for 5 minutes in a first round of discussion to help us frame these sets of issues and context. And then we'll go for a second round following that first one, 5 minutes to discuss how we might address or resolve these dynamics. We'll open up the chat at that point for some Q&A, so please feel free at that point to populate the chat with questions, and we'll do our best to allow some time for response. And as Lisa said, we will at 5:30 p.m. exit this webinar format and invite all of you to join us on a new Zoom session, a more interactive session facilitated by Ms. Geddes. So with that, I'd like to turn to our first panelist to open us up, Dr. Ragland. David, thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you all for being on this call. I would like to begin just by acknowledging that I'm currently on Ramapo Lenape land. And I'd also like to invite my ancestors as we are here because of their contributions and their wishes. And I'm gonna just name my grandmother, Moselle Miller, who grew up and lived throughout Jim Crow. She and her husband were sharecroppers and along with my father, until my father's father died when my dad was 13 years old. And they all picked cotton. And then they came a little bit north from Tennessee to St. Louis. And so, this is part of the history that we are living out, a history that has never been addressed fully, um, the whole truth never been told. But thinking about transitional justice in this moment, or transitional justice as looking at what are the criminal prosecution issues, what are the issues around truth telling and truth seeking and reparations and preventing, right, further harm. And in this moment, we've seen lots of calls for truth and reconciliation or some kind of truth process, particularly around the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and so many others. But also we have seen people who are really attempting to address and lift up this past harm so that we can heal from it and make repair around it. And I came into this conversation after Mike Brown Jr. was killed in St. Louis, Missouri, particularly having this conversation or conversations with scholars. Like I originally started off talking with other academics and a few activists, right, about this work, about dialogue, about truth and reconciliation. And then we held this massive gathering in Ferguson, Missouri, with all these activists, and we invited community members. And they came to me and were like, you should have came to us from the get-go. Like, you should have talked to us as well. And so we started there. And we really renamed and focused our work on truth telling, particularly because of the implications around truth and reconciliation, and particularly reconciliation, what many folk who in the faith community viewed as reconciliation, and many folk who were involved in transitional justice and TRCs thought about reconciliation as well. And the idea of being in the same room with police officers who have been brutal to activists and community members, spying, like, being complicit and spying on them, and all kinds of things that we're seeing now, just like with the release of the movie about Fred Hampton, right? But this stuff still occurs today. And so, like, having activists and community members say, like, I'm cool with truth telling, right? Maybe we can work about getting somewhere else. But sort of that first understanding that I learned from talking to my own home community brought me to, like, really sit down and look at TRCs as a process and transitional justice in ways that are rooted at its core in a white epistemological frame that centers the nation state and centers healing processes that are rooted in a Judeo-Christian framework, right? That are often imposed on communities by academics and scholars and TRC experts. And that really, in terms of what Ashley was talking about, counteracting, like, the healing work that was supposed to happen, especially since many communities already experience, academics dropping in, doing some research, getting some publications, and then, being out. And we tried in so many ways to try to change this dynamic, right? We were thinking, like, things have got to be different. In particular, even after that initial weekend where all the scholars and activists came, having a conversation with one academic in particular who wanted to come and do research on, what were Ferguson residents and activists' view of truth and reconciliation? And when we talked about it, I said, well, why don't you, I know you're not going to offer money. I know you don't have money, but um, what if you offer co-publication and write and like guidance from the community that you want to do this research in, right? So there's a real connection. And they basically, this academic asked me, do I actually understand what truth and reconciliation is? So those are some of the frames that we're coming from and addressing in this moment where from the president on down are talking about TRCs and truth processes.
Thank you so much, Dave, for helping us sort of framing this set of issues so well. And I'd like to turn it over now to Jody to take it on from here. Thanks.
Thank you all. My name is Jody Geddes. My pronouns are she, her, they, them, and I'm calling in from Ohlone land here in Oakland, California. Yeah, I feel like everything that David said is exactly what I'm thinking and carrying. So I'll try not to repeat all those things back to you. So I think for me, I come from a lens of being a restorative justice practitioner, but also someone who has been a longtime organizer to mobilize and to shift policies and practices on a systemic level, but also harms in which communities were being impacted on a daily level through this cycle of violence, trauma, and oppression. And so as I kind of hear Dave set this framework, one of the things that makes me really think about is that we're in this moment, this movement of reparations, right? There's a lot of funding that organizations and individuals are receiving. There's a lot of conversations happening, and it's happening in a visual way. And while I believe it's important to talk about reparations, I think in monetary ways, but also spiritual, mental health, and wellness. I think the conversation around reparations is very expansive, although I think you should still cut a check. I will be clear about that. And at the same time, we have to create space for the truth to be told and for voices that are also on the margins of the margins to be able to tell those truths. And so I think sometimes these things can happen. I'm a critic. Sometimes these things can happen in ways that are a form of symbolism. And while that's important, how can those processes lead to transformation in communities and repair in communities that are sustainable and break the cycles of violence and oppression that communities themselves didn't bring on themselves, right? So I think in many ways, creating space for truth telling in all of its ways, right? I think what David is really pointing to, and I've seen that happen, I think through the work that's happening in Evanston, the incredible work that happened in Elaine, Arkansas. So I know that there are examples of that. Even when I think about the Maine Wabanaki truth-telling process, there's an incredible film called Dawnland that I think creates opportunities for a stop and pause to say, like, what is a truth-telling process that is also rooted in healing? And so for me, I come from a lens of healing, that all my abolitionist dreams can come true, and yet the body keeps the score. How do we transform systems and structures that ultimately inform the relationships that we have with each other? But if we don't talk about the proximity of being in community, and really thinking about the residue that's left behind through the systems that uphold harmful legacies, practices, and ideologies about BIPOC folks that ultimately contribute to the violence in which we experience in our daily lives, is it simply reform, or is it truly calling for transformation? And what I want is transformation. And so to create spaces that engage folks in reimagining what freedom looks like, reimagining liberation, reimagining a world where joy isn't in opposition to white supremacy. It just is. And I think so much of that, for me, comes from a place of imagination. And it's very hard to do when you've been born into a world and here it is. Like here's this monster or multiple monsters, right? And So I've been in that place where I haven't been able to dream and imagine, and sometimes having conversations that can feel so abstract and so far away that it actually pushes people out of those spaces. And I've had the opportunity to be in academic spaces and to also be on the ground in moments of those challenges. And I want to be a bridge between those different communities, and think ultimately restorative justice practitioners and transformative and transitional justice practitioners are talking about the same things, but I think the process and the method looks different. So what does it mean to create that space to say, how can our practices merge so we can create space and opportunity for liberatory transformation to be possible in the body and also through systems? So I hope that was clear and helpful. I'm excited for what's to come next in our conversations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jody. So much there on truth, on co-creation, and just a note on that point. On that note, that today apparently the UN has declared it to be the International Day of Truth. So it's apropos of this conversation. And I'd like to hand it over to Jennifer now to sort of give us your perspective from the academic side of the house. So over to you. Thanks.
Well, coming out of, I'm so full of moment of imagining joy unbridled, and visioning that I'm not sure sitting, occupying the academic space makes me sound like that might bring us down quite a bit. So I'll try not to do that. My name is Jennifer Llewellyn, and my pronouns are she and her, and I'm coming to you from the east coast of Canada, where we just started to see the flowers poke up unusually early for us, and not even through the snow. So that is a sign of hope for sure. I live on the Mi'kmaq territory, Mi'kma'ki of the Mi'kmaq people, and I live in a province that is home to the longest standing African population. We have what we refer to as Indigenous African Nova Scotian populations who've been here for over 400 years, and certainly have shaped this land before folks like I arrived. So this is an humbling conversation to be invited into because of the wisdom that's in the room. So maybe I'll say a few things, and to ensure that there's lots of space and time for our conversations. When I kind of confront this question, it comes for me at sort of at least 3 levels. There's probably more, but I'm a relational theorist, so I tend to try to think about the ways in which we are bound up in these things together, and in terms of our relationships with each other, but also structurally in terms of, what is shaping and influencing and framing everything from our worldview to the way in which we show up in this together. Not by way of excuse or excusing the kind of responsibility we each hold individually, but by way of owning it in its fullness, right? The complexity of the challenge and of the responsibility being both individual and collective. And so at that level, I kind of immediately think about the ways in which, and this is maybe where you started, Ashley, the ways in which there has been a reckoning needing to come for a long time, I think, around the field of transitional justice. Because this experience, these questions we're confronting here are not questions that are only coming to us as the lens and the gaze of transitional justice. It has been brought down to the United States in this moment, or to North America as it did in Canada around the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but has been brought to other places, and often by North Americans as the experts, as the framers, as the very definers of a field, right? Gave it a name and then became expert in the thing they gave a name, that showed up then in ways that, rather than coming to learn or notice or help or support the sort of robustness of the very kind of bubbling up of truth-telling processes and grandmothers and elders and young people finding their way through incredible complexity that we could learn from, we should have showed up and defined that and put that in boxes. in ways that if we ask those stories, and I think we ought to as part of this examination, if we asked questions about those experiences, we would find a very powerful resonance across the world in the ways in which we need to be disrupting this field, right? Both in terms of its temporal imagination, transitioning from what to what, often not holding on to the goal of not just making the peaceful transition, but the transformation that must result from that. And that's the piece that I hear in Jodi's voice that I think got lost so much in other contexts. So I think there's something about that framing. And it is, we can't look away from the fact that it's very structured by both colonizing and colonial norms and capitalism, right? There are a lot of ways in which we constructed whole business models and non-profits, quite powerful philanthropic, attracting quite powerful philanthropic money around this field. The second then I think we've got to look at is the very structure of academia. And David raised this, right, around some real worries about the way in which the metrics by which people are judged, the ways in which we value, now we're valuing impact and impact scholarship, which I think makes us look for the marketplace of where we can have impact in a way that is quite, I think, worrisome. And so I think we need to think about that this has to happen at a real structural level around where and how we value knowledge. And then finally, I think it's got to happen at a personal level. And I might say a bit more about that in our second round, but for sure, we need to also avoid wearing like a mantle the work of being humble or stepping back or ceding the territory because it's hard or it's hot to kind of try to stand in the middle of it and actually not make yourself a martyr or some other kind of version that's the new privilege kind of move. And I don't know that we know how to do that, but I know we got to sit someplace. And this is maybe why I'm so excited about kind of the model of Jodi's response for us after this. We got to sit somewhere and figure that out. And so that's where I'll leave that before our next round.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And I didn't mean to put you in the academic box at all. I think you brought such a helpful perspective on sort of both the opportunity, but the constraints and the problematic ways in which those relationships have been developed over time, but the opportunity maybe to transform, as Jodi said, those dynamics. I'd like now to turn to Christine to finish off this first section of the panel. Over to you, Christine.
Thank you, Miigwech. Dinue magani duk, dindisi indigenakas, makinakwaju indunjibal, migizi indudame. And what I just said to you in my language, which is Anishinaabe-Moan, was greetings, my relatives. My name is Blue Jay. I am from Turtle Mountain Reservation, and I am Eagle Clan. My English name is Christine McCleave. Dindisi means Blue Jay in Ojibwe. And I'm really glad to see that everyone was acknowledging the indigenous lands that they are living on and occupying. I am here in Minneapolis, Minnesota on the traditional homelands of the Dakota, Anishinaabe, and Ho-Chunk peoples. And I am the CEO for the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. And our work is centered around addressing and understanding the ongoing trauma that was a result of the US Indian boarding school policy, a genocidal policy to remove Indian children and send them away from their tribal homelands, away from their families and communities, and assimilate them, which is to say colonize them into Western society to teach them to speak English and pray in Christian ways. Corporal punishment was used. Children were beaten and subjected to horrors if they spoke their own language, if they prayed in their traditional ways, or engaged in their traditional culture in any way. This was a horrific part of US history, and yet most people don't know that this happened in this country and that that was a federal policy. It was a policy aimed at breaking apart our tribal nations, and assimilating us into Western culture to make way for the westward expansion of this country. So it's tied to Indian treaty law, it's tied to land acquisitions, it's tied to a lot of different things. Our political status is unique in this country, as I am a dual citizen of my tribal nation and of the United States. A lot of times when we're doing this work and we're trying to explain to people the impacts of this legacy, it's a complicated story. It's a history that, like I said, most people don't know. So we have to start at the beginning. And then when it comes to understanding Indigenous peoples, there's what we call Indian 101. So there's a lot of obstacles for us to overcome in order for people to really understand our perspective. We have a very different cultural worldview. The way we look at things is almost opposite from Western culture in some cases. The way we view time, it's not linear, it's cyclical. The way we have cultural context, it's very low context. You are to know and read between the lines versus high context, where everything is very direct and put out there for you to, explicitly understand. That's why a lot of times Native people will tell you a story in an answer to a question. You'll be like, they didn't answer my question. Oh, yes, they did. In a story, in a narrative form. We have oral histories, and a lot of this is absolutely converse to the way academia operates. And so, yes. Thank you to the previous panelists who mentioned all the things that I was agreeing with and nodding my head. When David said he had someone who was asking him if he even understood what truth and reconciliation was, I've experienced that kind of gatekeeping where somebody with those three little initials after their name thinks that I might not have the same knowledge base as them. And maybe I haven't read the same books as they have, but we call it in our communities, Indigenous PhD knowledge, right? It's traditional knowledge. And a lot of times, not just academia, but our culture at large in this country does not honor our ways of knowing. We can look at environmental activists and our traditional ecological knowledge and how, that was not honored and respected. And now we're paying the price. The Indigenous peoples were the stewards of these lands for millennia. And now we really need to listen to that knowledge and that wisdom. So back to the Boarding School Healing Coalition, we were formed as a grassroots organization in response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was going on in Canada to address the Indian boarding schools there. And so we decided, we needed a similar process here in the United States. We are grassroots. We are a coalition of survivors of Indian boarding school and their descendants. We are also including allies as our membership. And so we were fortunate enough to work with Congresswoman Deborah Haaland last session to introduce a bill for a Truth and Healing Commission on Indian boarding schools, because it is time that this country acknowledge that history and really paid attention to the impacts that it's had on Indian communities.
Great. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for this quick round one, where we've really tried to unpack all of the different dimensions of this problem, but I guess also opportunity to reimagine different ways of relating to each other. I think, Christine, you have certainly named so many things about the ways that we collectively need to educate ourselves, even how to interface with Native communities, and also just how we need to privilege different kinds of knowledge and understand the important contributions of Indigenous, of environmental knowledge as much as three letters at the end of our names. I'd like to stay with you for a minute, if I may, and transition to the next part of the conversation, where we sort of think about the so what. So what do we do with this problem set that we've tried to articulate here? What are the responsibilities that we as stakeholders who want to work on this collective issue together have to take on board ourselves, right, on our own time? What are the responsibilities that we have to each other as we engage in this stakeholder community on this work together? And what can we do to kind of move forward collectively? So I'll start with you, Christine. I'm going to go backwards. So over to Jennifer, and then Jody, and end with David.
Sure, thank you. So I would challenge us to really think relationally. Most tribal nations and indigenous cultures in this country have a way of thinking about how we're all related, and not just human beings, but we're related to the plants, we're related to the animals, we're related to the water that sustains us. We're all connected on this planet. And so when we think about it, not just as humanity being one big family, but our home here on Mother Earth, we really enlarge the way we think about the world and ourselves in it. And what I think is important for this work, with that framework in mind, is that we really need to think of it as relational work. We really need to think beyond just a land acknowledgement, which, although is a great thing that came out of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the 94 calls to action there. It was, it's never been a mandate here in the US, but people have adopted it. And in fact, there's a resource that I'm going to drop in the chat here that is going beyond that land acknowledgement, because a lot of times there's a whole list of things that end up happening for Indigenous peoples. We get contacted, and people don't always offer to compensate us for our time, and they just want to know, what tribe do I have to acknowledge, but they don't want to actually make a relationship with that tribe or learn about that tribe and learn about the history and where are they today and what happened to them. And so it really is relational. And when we talk about truth telling and repairing the damage, that's not a quick one-step action, and a commission, although a great start, is also not the solution, because we can look to the main Wabanaki TRC, we can look to Canada's TRC, and those communities are still struggling with some of the same issues. There is still racism. They are still removing our children. They are still violating our human rights and our Indigenous rights. And so if we really think about it as how we build a better relationship going forward, then I think that changes the way we think about it. It changes that extractive dynamic that sometimes academia or that capitalist mindset of what can I get from this, changes it to what can I bring, what can I offer, what can we learn from each other. And I am part of a work group for the TRC process to happen here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And what's unique about our process for a TRC is that, as far as I know, it will be the first TRC in the country to address two racial groups at the same time. And as work group members, we've had to make space for that, just to acknowledge that fact that we're working cross-culturally, that each racial affinity group needs to spend time on their own talking about the issues for their communities, and then we need to make time to come together to learn from each other. And that's the beginning of this work. I mean, if we can do that, and then other people can join in, I really think that is what's going to lead us towards peace building, as we would like to say, and as we envision a better world where people respect each other's rights and appreciate their perspectives.
Thank you so much, Christine. And, I think what is so just refreshing is, for people who might sort of fear what this work might take them down into, the generosity with which you just invited people to come in relationship with you as you're doing this work. I mean, I just think that is such a important thing to elevate, that people engaging this want to do that, and are offering you this invitation to have relationship with them, but they want it to be authentic. They want it to be to receive that generosity back. And so thank you for that. back over to you, Jennifer, as we think about what responsibilities do we have collectively and on our own in our own work and institutions to help this collaboration move forward more productively.
Thanks. Well, maybe I'll pick up first on what Christine was just saying, because I couldn't agree more that I think challenging us to think about the worldview and perspective from which we seek to view these issues and engage is hugely important. And starting with this foundational acknowledgement of relationality and of a relational worldview, I think is key. And so I think that has a lot that has a lot of implications for the kinds of mechanisms or the kinds of pathways we walk or how we work if we want to do that kind of relational work. And I think it really does create a kind of a challenge to this assumption of finding a sort of either an off-the-shelf or adapted model that trades on, as David pointed out, these kinds of Western assumptions of truth and of reconciliation. For example, reconciliation sort of unmoored from the really robust relational conception of healing in Indigenous traditions as I've come to be taught about them, or as Jody was acknowledging is important, right? That then reconciliation becomes a demand of walking and working in reconciling ways all the way along. It's an ongoing commitment to a changed way of working and walking. It's not the destination or the end point, right? Or the thing we're going to achieve or produce. And that would have quite radical implications for the nature of this work and how we step into it and how long we expect it to take and how we come together in it. And I think that relational frame is essential to that kind of shift. I think that's why those who've been thinking about a truth and reconciliation process through the lens and knowledge of Indigenous justice ways and restorative justice ideas and Afrocentric principles have come to that more, to quite a different place in terms of thinking about what that has to be and ought to be as a shift. And then maybe the other thing I'd say is, for those of us within academia, I think we've got to be looking at those structural elements that get in the way of us being able to mobilize the quite significant resources, capacity of academic institutions to be places of convening, to bring resources and supports to kind of and recognition in a way that's helpful for it to be sustainable of different knowledge ways and different ways of working. So, I mean, we've got to start to resist personally the pull towards self-promotion that is seen as so necessary and so rewarded and encourages sort of the antithesis. Nobody asks, how did you work? Nobody says, because of the way you engaged, it's what you do. What can you claim credit for? What did you achieve? What things did you tick off? And if we can't challenge those very structural things that don't they get in the way and don't encourage people to show up differently, then I think we'll constantly be reacting to those behaviors instead of unlearning and relearning the way we've got to be if we want to step into the kind of work and meet the invitation that Christine and others have so graciously put before us, right? So I'll leave it there.
Thank you for that, Jennifer. And so important to sort of point to the incentives around the structures that condition certain kinds of behavior. It is the way that work is incentivized to be not relational, but to be outcome focused. Jody, over to you to give us some more thoughts on this question.
I'm moving so much in my chair because I'm just getting so excited. I'm like a little kid that's like told to sit still. Thank each of you so much for what you shared. Like, everything just happening in my mind right now. I'm really thinking a lot about time. And for me, I often say time isn't real, while also honoring the time that folks give me when we're in spaces together. But I think so many times when we're talking about kind of transforming, dismantling, and abolishing, there is a certain urgency that I actually think comes from white supremacist culture about, okay, you make a plan and then you achieve that plan the next year. right? And often it's not sustainable when we think about folks that receive funding to carry out projects in communities, right? We are working 10, 20, 30 years at the same thing. It's like this constant wheel, this constant cycle. And a lot of that is intentional, and it's a part of the way that capitalism works to maintain these structures and hierarchies of oppression. So I'm thinking a lot back to Angela Davis was giving a speech that I use as a part of a meditation, and she was really talking a lot about what if we thought about the kind of end game, so to speak, I'm paraphrasing, in the next 100 years, right? Like thinking about the 7 generations forward, right? And the critical importance of that, I think it changes how we engage with systems and what we see as action, right? So often when I'm engaging and folks come into space, they'll say, you're doing too much talking, right? I want the action, but even the ability to be in space and to think through these things is critically important, because there are moments I've seen folks go straight towards action. A conflict happens, everyone is disposable. That I am right, because there's a disagreement in how we do something, or even just how we be that. For me, especially in the restorative justice world, I don't make the assumptions of what the values are that folks bring into space. I create an opportunity for that to be named. And I also acknowledge conflict as normal, that there are moments we're going to stumble and disagree, but how do I commit to not making you disposable? Because then I'm replicating these patterns that I've learned, that when things get hard, you throw people away. When there's disagreement, you throw people away, right? And so I'm thinking a lot about, in our framework, thinking about things like truth telling and reparations, that we have to recognize that these things, and I think we here get it, but these things will happen automatically. That what is the view 100 years from now, 20 years from now, so that we're not creating kind of short-term solutions that don't ultimately transform the systems. Like, I'm not trying to make the prison industrial complex nicer or better. Like, I just don't want it to exist. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm not trying to create nice prisons, which I'm seeing in a lot of even some of these places of abolition, a lot of folks talking about, these kind of mental health facilities, which is just kind of replicating the prison industrial complex. And so a lot of that, I think, is really bounded within capitalism, and how do I fulfill this thing in the next 5 years? And so anyways, I have a lot of things going through my mind. I might not be clear, but I think we need to have a kind of long-term vision of not just transforming this one structure, but our world, our country, right? And I think all of that will then inform the creation of solutions that are sustainable, and once again, just not symbolic, and doesn't save face, that we don't have to be the pioneers. Like, I'm not an expert in restorative justice. I am taking from what has come before, the idea of Sankofa. I am going back. For me, restorative justice is a practice of remembering, right? Before colonization, before these practices were taken, how do I remember my Taino and Maroon roots? That it's just called restorative justice today, but how do we remember and honor the Afrocentric and indigenous roots of restorative justice that inform a worldview that is a long-term vision of transformation, and not just something that is symbolic and makes its experts and shuts people out, in which these practices have come from. I hope that was more clear towards the end. I feel like it was, but digress.
Jody, very clear, very helpful, especially building on so much of what others have said about your long-term view, how you build relationship with others, and have what I heard you speaking to really is resilience. We're building a resilience to how to be in relationship with each other, such that conflict doesn't destroy that relationship. So such good stuff. David, over to you for our last few minutes here.
It's all been said. I mean, I'm floored continue to be floored by the brilliance of Jody, Christine, and Jennifer. And I mean, I think a couple of thoughts, just that, before folks were talking, I was thinking about, the way communities are suffering now, right? And like, how do we manage the urgency, right, of oppression that people are feeling with this long-term vision? And but then the other piece that I was thinking about is like around truth telling in terms of like, you know, how do we move this forward? How do we work together? And one of the things that I always said, and this, you know, coming from like I come from an academic area of peace and conflict studies, right? And peace building. And what I would always tell students is um, find out what's already there. Like if you want to know what processes that are transforming the community, what are people doing already? And it's always somebody in a community doing something to sustain and transform their community. And then I just want to reiterate that folks said that truth telling is one of the first steps, right? It's a first step. And I think that it's, and many of us, it is a sacred process. It is a spiritual process. What does that look like, right? As we handle with care what people are coming with, right? These experiences that people are coming with that, you know, range from recipes to missing children, right? And how is that not like a checked box or a list of things that people do? And then also, I'm really thinking about how does truth telling lead to reparations? And I love the way that the UN offers this process frame within transitional justice, particularly on this day, right? Which is a day when we're talking about gross violations against human rights. And we're talking about our people that were genocided and enslaved, and that those processes and projects are still ongoing. And so, how does this truth that is coming out from these communities, how is our end game also reparations, right? A reparations that is deep. Like Jody said, I still want to check. Yes, I do. Right. But how is it also restitutions? Right? How is there also satisfaction or memorial and culture building and education? And how is it healing? Spiritual, right? Given that our religions were stolen, right? And mental, given mental health, given the fact that to live in this culture, to accept this culture is to accept and be bombarded, right, with visions that deny your humanity. I just saw on the internet this lady dressing up like a black woman. I was like outdone. Or a lady at the Starbucks calling the dude the N-word for not serving her because she doesn't have a mask on. How are we, you know, dealing with January 6th? Are we holding the last executive, right, accountable, or are we just saying let's heal? Like that's not what healing looks like. I think part of the reason, I think part we have to acknowledge why we're here, right? Why the Biden administration, for instance, is in place. And it is because of activists like the folks who are on this call, who demanded, right, that he do A, B, and C, and that they got behind him. And decolonization is not a metaphor. Neither is reparations. And don't do that shit no more.
Thank you, Dave. You ended on an emphatic message there about what it all ends up as. We are a little bit at the end of our time, so what we're going to do is to extend this portion of the webinar for an additional 10 minutes. To we started a couple minutes late to allow us to have a few minutes of Q&A, and then we'll transition to the next portion, the more interactive portion. So with that, we're going to start, and I believe we're opening up the chat for folks to ask some questions. So let me see here. We have a question here about institutions are based on narrative. Unless narrative changes, the oppressive nature of the system can remain despite individual policy improvements. So in other words, unless the intent to cause harm is not addressed, then even though it's a significant objective, it's not going to prevent future harm. So I think this question is sort of trying to get at one of these tenets of transitional justice is around non-reoccurrence, right? How do we get at a transformative process that ensures that we aren't going to replicate the kinds of harms that have created and led to this the need for this work in the first place? So how do if one or two of you want to answer this idea about what does it look like to get to the non-reoccurrence part of the transformation?
We think about this a lot at the Boarding School Healing Coalition, because for us, that truth telling part is the most important. Like 70% of our programs are around education, trying to raise awareness, because we feel like, you know, if people can't even acknowledge that this country had genocidal policies against the indigenous people, there's absolutely no way we're going to be able to change things going forward. So for us, it really starts with that acknowledgement, which the United States has never acknowledged the harms that it did through these policies. So we can't really move forward until there is that acceptance and acknowledgement of the truth.
I think there's something really important to notice about truth and reconciliation efforts, that it isn't about being sort of the magpie for collecting as much truth. Often that is not the problem. It's not that we don't know, it's that we can't, we've not made it common sense, right? We've not come to understand what matters about what happened in the way that it becomes our narrative, right? And so I love David saying, you know, there's something sacred about truth telling, which is not just about collecting facts, right, and amassing a record. It's about making that our, you know, our common agreed upon history that then compels action, right? And something in that narrative part of the question, which is we have to change the stories we tell about ourselves, about who is us, as you started us with that question, Ashley. And I think of some of the coming to the table work that Jody's been doing in that regard.
And it's about, oh, sorry, I thought you were, I was like, she paused, let me jump in. I think it's about who gets to tell that truth, right? Like to continue on what Jennifer was saying, it's not, oh yes, we want the government to tell us what happened. No, we want actually Indigenous voices to be heard, because of the genocide, we're dealing with invisibility, and we're the most marginalized amongst the marginalized, you know, so it needs to be our voices. That's where the truth comes from.
Can I add something real quick? I think one of the things I'll also say is that sometimes when folks like reach out to RJoy and they say, I'm interested in having a truth-telling process, so much of it is about convincing like systems of white supremacy that this truth is real, and that also this person's humanity matters. And I think about my own experiences of feeling like that's what I was doing. And I think so much of it is this space for people who have, I think to what each of you are speaking to, who have been directly impacted, to even have a space to share that truth. I think about when I served as a commissioner in Elaine, I continue to go back to that process because I had no idea what I was getting into. It was incredibly transformative because folks, there was propaganda throughout the Elaine, Arkansas community after the massacre. So folks couldn't even share the stories with each other. They couldn't even talk with each other because the way that the propaganda had been internalized. And so you have stories that are being carried through the body with families for generations. And here is this moment to tell the truth. And when folks were asked, like, what can we do? They just said, everywhere you go, talk about Elaine. So I made a commitment to uplift and amplify Elaine because that was the request, right? That was given to me. And I didn't make an assumption that someone needed me to apologize. And even from that truth-telling process, they're embarking on this journey through the Elaine Legacy Center on reparations. that came from this moment of folks having just the opportunity to tell the truth and to talk about the impact of that. Because I think sometimes what happens is the kind of structural and historical pieces of this trauma and legacy of enslavement and genocide is not seen. It's like, this thing happened, and now we want to talk about this thing that happened then. No, it's still happening. That's the issue. That's the problem. Not that it just happened. It is still happening, and we cannot acknowledge, and now I'm getting a little upset, but the real human cost of violence and whiteness. That's a problem. We got a lot of healing to do, all of us, no matter what we look like and where we come from. On these lands, there's a lot of healing to do when we cannot acknowledge the real human cost of this kind of violence. It is not just ideas. They are lived out in policies and practices that impact people's everyday lives from the moment they wake up. We don't want to live that way, but this is the reality. This is the legacy in which we've inherited, and we have to do something to change it. Okay. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Preach, Jody. There's been a couple questions, and I think we've talked to this a little bit about this, the multi-generational nature of sort of truth telling and also sort of education for the future generations. I mean, this discussion around multiple generations of both violence and harm, but also kind of the gift of what we give to our future. And so there's been a couple of points on that in the chat, but actually I don't want to acknowledge that, but I want to go also to this question from Dennis Klein, where he's really looking at comments, Jody and David, that you both made about conflict and sort of the long-term relationship building and work that needs to be done if we look across 100 years. But can we really achieve reconciliation? In other words, is it possible if it's all about the journey, can we really achieve that closure, that healing that gets us to an end point? And if not, what does reconciliation really mean? Is it achievable even in a lifetime, or is it this longer term 100-year endeavor?
I mean, I honestly think it depends on what reconciliation looks like, right? And who is describing what that looks like. And, if the impacted communities are actually like in charge of it. And, yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And, I like what Christine said, like if truth telling is 70% of that work, and Jody talked about, right, 100 years of truth telling. I think having that truth and coming up with a common agreement, that in the way that Jennifer Llewellyn described it, I think that's part of what reconciliation looks like, right? I think it is a necessary part, right? Because I think what's really important is that as we look to address gross violations of human rights, it's necessary that that's populated, right, by these experiences that have been left out up until then. And because part of what truth telling is rebuilding culture. It is part of resituating what is sacred. And, those are some of the deepest digs for folks often, right? When, their language, right? Their dialect, right? Their way of viewing the world, right, is taken away. And I do want to say that, a lot of communities are speaking out right now, and they're saying reparations, right? And they're talking about full reparations. And for many, that's what, reconciling looks like, right? Or, getting to that, we can talk about truth, we can do some reparations, and then let's see, right? So it's kind of like, let's see, right? And it depends on what you view reconciliation as.
Jody, do you have
Yeah.
any comments on that? Or sorry, go ahead, Jennifer. Sorry, I have my chat
It's
box and
okay. I
your
just think
faces.
something keeps my mind. I don't have anything to add, so I'll pass it over
Okay.
to you then.
Jennifer.
Well, I think I was longing for that. I was recalling Christine saying to us, sometimes people ask the question and then they get what is a story and say, well, when you asked my question, you're like, actually, we did. I kind of feel like this is one of those questions that we ask and we don't recognize that actually the kind of work we got to do is restricting us from being able to even answer this. Like we talk about reconciliation in these very linear Western notions, like we're going to produce it, or we're going to get there, or it's going to be one and done, or, and this goes to Jody's points about what are we producing? Like we don't have those relational concepts to describe what we actually think this radical commitment to living in a different way would be. And I think, is that possible? I don't think it's ever going to be done in the sense that it's got to be this radical obligation about the way we would show up and keep showing up and dismantling and unlearning and relearning. And I don't mean that things can't get better. I think our measure is, are things getting better? Are we moving in that direction? Are we able to be in that way with one another? And there's real work to do to even conceive of that, let alone make things better. And of course, reparations, the conditions that would make that way of living possible have to change, right? And so I hear reparations as part of that. How are we going to actually change to create the conditions that we could ever live this way? That's got to be on the table.
And I just want to jump in really quickly and just say, like, you made a really good point. Like, that's the very question, right? And I actually forgot the point I was going to make, so I'll be quiet. But I will say that, there's a question about reparations in there, how it's going to be funded. Look at the news, right? I don't know if you're reading the news, but also, why aren't we asking the question, how are we funding war? How are we funding police that continue to destroy our communities? So how are we funding these nonprofit institutes that we have to go over and redo what they did, right? Because they were working on some report to get done. I mean, if we don't do some like radical truth telling in this moment and do it however long it takes, come 4 years from now, right? And we haven't taken enough time to actually deal with stuff, we'll be dealing with something even worse.
I have
Christine.
I have a lot of strong opinions about the word reconciliation. I could probably write a whole paper, or we could take a whole session on it. I think it's important to recognize what David said about, coming to terms on agreement of what the term means, because the word comes from the Bible to be reconciled to God. And, if you look at it in accounting, it's like, okay, we've got two accounts and how do we reconcile these two, narratives? But really, the thing I like about the transitional justice model is that there is that promise not to continue to do harm. And I think for minorities, for BIPOC people, for those of us who are living with systematic racism and oppression on a daily basis, even engaging in this conversation about reconciliation and reparations, it's triggering. And those systems of oppression and those narratives of oppression are in our face, and we're stuck dealing with it. So we could tell the truth, but through the truth telling process, then we get traumatized again because people don't believe our truth, or they dismiss it, or it's like, okay, thanks for sharing, but we're going to keep doing the things the way we're doing because it costs too much to do it differently. So I think there's a lot to unpack there. You could probably do a third session of this series.
Thank you so much, all. I believe we are going to close it out now. We have gone well over because we had such a robust discussion from this wonderful panel, but so much wonderful insight from all of you. I certainly learned an incredible amount, and I think that it's just given us a great foundation to continue the conversation that I hope we're going to have in the next session. So I think that we're going to have the team put up a PowerPoint slide that's going to have a link to the Zoom where we can join each other and have a more interactive conversation. So I'm going to leave it to the technical team here to do that. And I see it coming up now. And so you'll see that information here. I think we'll have the link also be put in the chat as well. And you don't have to pre-register for this. So feel free to join if you haven't, even if you haven't pre-registered. And so thank you all for joining this webinar today, again, on the Transitional Justice in the USA Speaker Series. It's been our privilege to share this conversation with you, and we'll look forward to the next session.